The credits play, and then we can maybe have a discussion about some of the themes raised in the film, the implications maybe for us in this part of New England. Just take a moment to gather your thoughts and reflections, and then somebody's ready with a reaction or a comment or a question.
I'll start.
Please.
So, hi everyone. My name is Elsie. The allyship piece really is sitting with me at the moment. I recognize that as a community, as a society, we have made Native and Indigenous people invisible, and that, you know, we have, or I'll speak for myself, I need to make a commitment to changing that and work together with people to bring these truths to bear in spaces that, you know, I impact. So I'm interested in exploring, you know, more with this group that's here, and I'm assuming committed to making change, you know, exploring how we can make that happen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
See, I mean, I think, you know, that is one of the most interesting and challenging parts of this film, right? This kind of that central moment in that film where they're all gathered around that table, right? After a session of the TRC, they're in the house and it's night and they're having this really hard conversation about how you reach that point of working together, and there's this tension in the room. You can feel it between the white members of the commission and the staff, and then the Native members of REACH. And it is a good question, right? Because you know, the white folks want to be good allies, but the ask being made of them is really hard, which is to say, well, decenter yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Set yourself aside. And I think it's not explicit in the film, but Heather, right, the white director of the TRC, is in fact replaced with a Native director after that exchange. So she actually, you know, is steps down.
Yeah.
And is replaced, and you know, and the work goes forward. But I mean, that's. I don't know what to you know, I don't know how there's a particular insight out of that, but what that means then is about, you know, kind of setting yourself aside. And allyship sometimes means setting yourself aside and giving space to different voices.
Or to the voices of the people that have not been at the table. Right?
Exactly.
To that
yeah.
narrative, right? Yeah.
Right.
So that's what really you know, like, is resonating with me, because I feel like, you know, in her sort of comments back, she was saying how, you know, it's not about you, unfortunately, right? So that becomes very kind of like an attack on an individual, right? We would say, like, that becomes personal, like a personal attack. And in reality, you know, the problem and the genocide that happened to this group of people is way bigger than you as a person, you know, and it's hard for people to, for individuals to sit with that.
It is, it really resonates with me because, you know, when you're kind of in the field of human rights and social justice, right, your identity is wrapped up in this idea that you're out there to make change and do good. And then, you know, there's I feel sometimes like it's easy to feel gratified when people tell you you're on the right side, right?
That
you know,
you're a
when
good
you
person.
feel like you can feel that sense of self-righteousness, like I'm a good person because I stick up for these things. But that can be toxic because then you want to insert yourself in all these spaces and be the agent of change when sometimes the best thing you can do is not. Don't be an agent. Don't like, you know, Heather said, I want to use my white privilege for good effect. Well, sometimes that's exactly wrong. That just reinforces your white privilege, and you need to actually abandon it in some ways. So that, I mean, that raises those really difficult questions for me too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just like, I guess to be an ally would be, you know, be able to recognize sort of who you are in the context of the people you're, you know, trying to serve, and recognize how your identity perhaps can change that dynamic. And yeah, the point of inserting yourself definitely is interesting, because if you're saying, you know, I have, you know, essentially more power than you, and my word is in our political climate, you know, more important than yours, or maybe that's a little extreme, or more valued than yours because I have this privilege, is kind of like shoving it in someone's face in a way. You know? So I think it's great to be an agent of change and things, but I think it's important to recognize who you are in that context, and not to say what your place is, but what perhaps your limitations may be.
Right. We've got this project over in the Humanities Institute called now it's called the Humility and Conviction in Public Life Project, right? This notion that there's a place where, like, humility is really this kind of critical practice. And humility doesn't mean like, oh, I suck, and, you know, I can't do anything right, and, you know, and make yourself subservient or obsequious, right? But it means exactly kind of having a knowledge of your own limits, and honoring those and recognizing those in your work with others. I mean, it's not to say that, right, leveraging some of that privilege can't be a good thing. I think of the Parkland students, right? And after, you know, they got all this kind of media attention, and, you know, they were clearly like this center of this, you know, kind of emerging political force. You know, they got on a plane and went to Chicago and met with kids in Chicago for whom violence is a daily occurrence. It's not this kind of media, it doesn't warrant coverage on CNN, so that they could say, look, right, when we talk about violence in schools, we're not just talking about these mass shooter incidents, we're talking, we want to also talk about the people for whom violence is either a kind of like physical violence, and shootings are a daily occurrence, or there's a slow violence of racism and poverty that's impacting their lives. And I thought that was a really kind of brilliant maneuver on their part, and was a kind of deployment of the privilege that they had garnered by the virtue of them being in a kind of white suburban school and being articulate and attractive to the media. So it's hard, right? It's a difficult thing. Other kind of reactions or things that are surfaced by this film? Yeah.
So I was kind of confused. Like, one thing that wasn't clear by the film, I know they mentioned that like the sort of like the Child Protective Services kind of like took away the kids because they assumed that they were not being treated well. I know they mentioned that has to do because like it's as if they're like using American standards in like a sense of different country, but I don't understand like what is it about Native Americans that seems so bad to the American government as like parents and stuff?
Do you mean like kind of overall across history, or specifically in the kind of the period that the TRC was looking at was like 1999 to present day?
I suppose any time, but I was mostly looking at the period they were describing in the film of that happening.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, that's a good question, and it's complicated because and this is one of the challenges of doing these analyses, because if you look at any particular case, you can find, reasonable grounds for why a child welfare agency would be concerned, right? So maybe the children are being left at home unattended, or maybe, their, access to nutrition is not as regular as it should be. Maybe the parent has a substance abuse problem or is in an abusive relationship. And if you kind of put your blinders on and look only at the specific case, then it becomes a kind of, oh, well, I can kind of see, and we need to get that child out, and it's hard to find foster placements, let's just find them somewhere and we'll put it there, and you understand, limited time, limited resources, doing the best you can. But if you back up the lens a little bit, and you ask certain questions about why those circumstances are particularly prevalent among indigenous or native households, then you ask different questions about, what are the kinds of pressures that disenable parents, native parents, to be able to provide those things. And we heard a little bit about that in here, and it generally is this kind of notion of intergenerational trauma, right? That the kind of compounding influence of 400 years of kind of a targeted assault on your life and your culture will leave you ill-equipped as a parent to, provide those resources. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, again, this notion that there are kind of cultural visions of what's appropriate parenting. So you heard one of the social workers in there kind of, giving her explanation, and then at the end she kind of gives this quip, sometimes 2 sneakers on the feet are more important than learning a native dance. And that's a little kind of insight there, because in the kind of child welfare agency's vision, culture's just a dance, right? It's just something you do on the side. And you heard from a lot of the natives who spoke that culture is the only thing that lends meaning and direction to their lives. And in fact, it is the only mechanism by which they've been able to survive and endure a kind of concentrated onslaught. And so a native household that would make decisions to prioritize cultural affiliations over material, the kind of trappings of a material middle-class lifestyle, is just not visible to the child welfare agency, right? They just see that as deprivation. And there's a lot of other little things, right? You heard about the families, right? So the kind of idea that sometimes native children would be dropped with their grandparents for a couple of weeks, and and then the parent would come back, and that would be regarded as abandonment by the child welfare. But in the indigenous culture, that's like just what you do, because everybody's responsible for these children, and we're all kind of contributing to their raising. So, all of those factors layer on top of one another till you get to this point where you have this crisis of this kind of way disproportionate removal of children. Does that make sense?
And I think a big part is this depth and complexity to these wounds that we're trying to allow for the healing of is a big part of why trying to implement privilege is not really an effective way to solve the issues. And taking a step back and allowing for that healing is really crucial. And I think that's where our definition of being an ally really needs to be reframed. And then also with being comfortable with that uncomfortableness, because it's not a space for our own healing, or in the case of a white person who is concerned with the ongoing issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good point. Well, both on the side of the kind of complexity of these things, and that, you know, we tend to like, you know, solutions, right? We have a problem, here's what you do, and the problem's solved. And sometimes you have a problem, and you don't know what you don't know the solution, and you just have to work on it. And that work takes time, and it's messy, and it's awkward, like you say, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. And we're not good at like welcoming those kinds of processes into our systems and structures. And then there's of course this idea that you heard about. You know, sometimes Native communities just need to be alone, right? That healing to take place, if it is going to be messy and complex, and they have to surface. You know, it's got to happen amongst themselves, not on a stage in front of the eyes of the white community, right? Because you can see in there these really kind of just utterly horrific mixtures of shame and guilt and their own sense of victim, right? It's like they were themselves these victims, but then they went on to victimize others. Right? And I mean, even Sandy Whitehawk talks about how she, as a mother, right, she couldn't even hold her child. And coming to terms with that is hard, it's hard with people you trust intimately, let alone with a kind of circle of like, can we get to the reconciliation now? I mean, let's just get on with it. So I totally get that. I mean, the other part of the complexity, and so Gisatanamuk, right, Sandy Whitehawk and Gisatanamuk are the two Native representatives on the commission in Gisatanamuk. He kind of sneaks it in there in the talk, but where he says, I'm not sure if the United States is going to be around, but you all will be around, right? And we'll figure out a way to live together. I mean, that's the other, kind of scary thing. There's the uncertainty of the micro process, like what it's going to mean for you personally to deal with this, but then there's the uncertainty of the macro process. That if we're serious about confronting the question of colonization in the United States, that puts everything on the table. Right? All our political institutions, all of our social organizations. And that's, I mean, right, that's pretty scary. Right? In a macro way. And so I think, if we do this right, it opens up that possibility that maybe what we have right now goes away. And what comes next, we don't know. Right? What could be scarier than that? But what could be more important if we also think these are real issues? So. Anything else? Other questions or reactions? Yeah.
I was just going to sort of pick up on what we were talking about, and I was struck by the complexity of asking people to tell their stories and the trust that is involved with that, but also this notion of like, we sometimes think as allies that that's going to empower people, but it's also speaks with questions about who's listening, how are you going to use my story, how am I going to tell my story, and so just sort of thinking through it. On one hand, it sounds like the right way to move forward, right, is to ask to hear people's stories, but how it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah. It is and it's, well, you know this as a kind of researcher and scholar, right? As somebody, if you do qualitative research on human rights issues and you're kind of engaging with communities and asking them to tell their stories to you, I mean, there's a level of exploitation of that, just plain and simple, right? It's like, I'm going to publish an article and I'm going to get tenure off the backs of these studies, right? And the filmmakers I know grappled with that, right? they're now touring the country and receiving all kinds of accolades for this. And so there's like that ethical piece to it. I mean, obviously all the people who are featured in this film have been recognized and they signed up and they're really supportive, but nevertheless, it's a tough thing. And in part they do it because there is that expectation that telling their story is going to yield some positive change. But that's not guaranteed, right? I mean, people bet, right? I mean, on a micro, right? Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, endured hell to tell her story in a powerful, compelling, universally recognized as, credible way. And the results are Justice Kavanaugh, right? So it is, yeah, it is hard. And what's the long term? I mean, what's her long-term fate, and then what's the fate of all of these folks who tell their stories and hope for change, hope for personal change, but hope for social change, right? In many ways, it places responsibility on the hearers, on the people who've listened to those stories, to not betray that trust that they placed in you, and they placed it in all of you because they said yes to this film, that you were going to do something to make real what they were aspiring to do. So. Other?
I just think that's really important, Glenn, because for us to hear in spaces like this, because it almost always feels like when we hear something like that, we feel like we don't have power to change it. Oh, that's someone else's job, right? And that's very worrisome for me, and I have sleepless nights for, cases and all of the issues, a lot of issues around diversity and inclusion, because it just feels like, I often wonder, how many people do I have to talk to, or, in order for systematic process to change, to affect change to the system.
Do you want a number?
No, I'm just saying, that's that's just
No,
me. It's and I know it's difficult because we all are searching for an answer, right? What is the step-by-step guide that will get us, the answer that we want? And that's difficult. That's just nothing. So I just.
Yeah. No. Right. Well.
Yeah.
There are no guarantees. There is no book, right? The only books that are written are the books on how to keep that change from not happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Indeed.
That's in fact what most books are.
Indeed.
How to keep the status quo. Mm-hmm. So it is hard. Yeah.
I think it's important too, in recognizing that maybe we won't be able to change the individual circumstances of these people by letting them hear out their stories, but we can change the circumstances of issues that are unraveling currently, like the taking of children to boarding schools is not all that unlike the taking children from families and letting them be adopted by white families at the Mexican border. That's been unraveling through the New York Times articles in the past few days. So.
That is an excellent point. Yeah. I mean, part of these are lessons about the past and what's happened, and we do have to work to redress those, but part of them are about, our ability to recognize what's happening around us through a lens that focuses in on injustice, right? That renders that clear and gives you the appropriate level of outrage. I couldn't agree more that exactly that process is a continuation of this exact same kind of logic and thinking.
Sure, because we apply the system of oppression to multiple identities and groups, underrepresented groups. And as, you know, as a community, we sit back to watch and be like, oh, that kind of sucks.
Right.
And then that's it.
And let's not overlook that a good number of those people crossing the border are in fact Indigenous people,
Oh, yeah.
right? That is, you know, that's kind of like the question earlier about, you know, well, why do the families, you know, those same pressures that lead to drug abuse and alcoholism and some of those things are leading to migration in other contexts. And so, you know, that's the reason why now you're taking their children, right? Oh, you made the illegal decision to cross the border is just the same logic against the same, well, not, I mean,
Yeah.
different identity
Yeah.
groups, but a kind of, again, the same kind of targets of colonialism. So.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, this always leaves me in this difficult place of recognizing that empathy is not sufficient. But also thinking about, I go back to this idea of like, what's my sphere of influence? And so when I think the director of social work program was talking, I resonate with that because she has a similar position that I would hold. And it's like, okay, so what can I do with my position as a faculty member here at UConn? That's probably going to be more authentic and more effective than if I try to go change child welfare laws, like, because I don't know that system, right? But there are things that I think I can do pretty easily within my sphere of influence that could affect change.
Yeah.
So that's usually where I start so knowing that empathy is not sufficient, but I do have a sphere of influence with access to resources and people and ideas that I could maybe move forward.
That is excellent advice, right? You know, it's like the field you're already working in is the field you should be working in, right? To undo these, because if this picture is correct, then it's right. It quote unquote it's structural, which means it's part of everyone's daily life and work, and each one of those becomes an opportunity to engage. So yes, you don't have to fly down to the border, right, and work with ISIS on finding legal help for right. If that's not your skill set, if that's not what you do, don't do it. Then you're just a tourist, right? So where you're at, what you're working on, what you're already doing, figure out how to make it more just. Should we end on that?
Sure.
Anybody else got anything they want to add? So I can decenter myself. NACP, you want to say anything? You don't have to. I'm not going to compel your testimony here. So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming. It was a delight. Sorry again about the late start, but thank you for sticking around. And we have one more thing going on for Indigenous Peoples Week, right? Tomorrow, tabling in the Student Union for signatures for the petition to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. You probably all have signed, but you probably know people who have not signed. So that's something you could do. You all have the ability to talk to your friends and neighbors and to encourage them to join this effort. So,
we also would like to announce that today we hit 1,000 signatures on the petition.
Woo!
And also, if anyone hasn't signed yet, I do have copies up here if you want to come down and sign.
Great.
Thank you guys.